he started Turning Point USA. That became the largest conservative grassroots youth organization in the country. And then one of the worst organizations, in my opinion, the Southern Poverty Law Center, had the gall to put Turning Point USA on a map with Klan chapters,
So
suggesting
crazy.
that there's white supremacism. And then we had this. And I think it is long past time that that particular organization remove Turning Point USA from the hate map. There are many other groups that it has to remove. But I think in the wake of this huge historic moment, the fact that they haven't removed Turning Point is damning. And we need to continue to demand that they do that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I appreciate you bringing that point up. And I want to delve a little bit, as far as the investigation goes. We're told now that the FBI is investigating several different left-wing groups that are based in Salt Lake City, which actually appears to be a hotbed for some of this extremism. We see our FBI Director, Kash Patel, there discussing this. What has your own work uncovered about how some of these groups operate and their agenda?
Yeah, so I've been focused generally nationally on the organizations, particularly that staffed and advised the Biden administration and the network that propped them up, what I call the left's dark money network. And this is a network of donors who often hide the way that they send their money to prop up these organizations. And then these organizations influenced policy in the Biden administration. But some of them have also had really disturbing ties to some of these protests that turn into riots, particularly opposing ICE, opposing the enforcement of immigration law. And this raises a lot of concerns. I mean, how much do organizations that fund the left, parts of the left's dark money network, do these groups really vet where their money is going? And if they oppose political violence, as they say they do, are they doing everything they can in their due diligence to prevent their money from propping up political violence? And these are questions that have to be addressed, that have to be looked into. Because, I talk about the Southern Poverty Law Center a lot because I've been focused on them. I think they're the tip of the spear in undermining religious freedom and free speech of conservatives in America. And they have constantly carried water for Antifa, for this violent movement that engaged in attacks on
Terrible.
law enforcement, that engaged in attacks on, federal buildings, and everyday citizens, everyday businesses were burned down to the ground in the 2020 George Floyd riots. And that doesn't mean everybody involved in the Black Lives Matter movement is responsible, but there are many organizations that were propping up these protests, and the protests led into violence. At some points, it's very clear that these groups were organized. They had shields with Black Lives Matter on them, with Antifa slogans, going after people engaging in violence, throwing Molotov cocktails. This is a real threat. And I'm glad to see that under President Trump, we have an FBI that's willing to investigate this. I
It's
do
really
think it's
true. And you
important.
see these groups that have deleted their Instagram accounts and just a lot of very disturbing things. And I know you've written about several organizations that have been eager to, label, as you discussed earlier, conservative groups as hate groups, but oftentimes left-wing organizations, they get a pass. There's just a complete double standard. What has your book and your work in particular uncovered?
Yeah, thank you. That main issue with the Southern Poverty Law Center overlooking Antifa violence,
Yes.
overlooking Black Lives Matter, not including, and they have a new category. They have anti-government extremist groups that they put on the hate map, and they've put Moms for Liberty under that banner.
So crazy.
And they don't put actual groups that organize attacks on federal law enforcement buildings under that banner. So, like, if you oppose teachers pushing critical race theory and gender ideology on kids in opposition to parental rights, you're on the hate map with chapters of the Klan. But if you engage in violent attacks on federal law enforcement or on, everyday homes and businesses that were burned down in these riots, and you're calling for systemic change and engaging in violence, you're nowhere on the hate map. You're not even listed as an anti-government extremist group. So I think it is long past time we send the message that nobody should be relying on the Southern Poverty Law Center when it comes to hate. And we should
Exactly.
also be looking very critically at groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which has rightly called out a lot of violence against Jews and anti-Semitism, but is often engaged in some of the same strategic misrepresentation of facts that allows people to say, oh, all the violence comes from the right and it never comes from the left. Because you hear this talking point over and over again, but you ask, like you mentioned specific people, like the Nashville shooter
Right.
who identified as transgender. Like so many of these people who are identifying as transgender are mentally unstable, engaged in violence from a left-wing perspective. And the ADL and the SPLC and other groups try to find any excuse to say they're not left-wing violence. Meanwhile, anybody who once wrote something, that they say is racist and engaged in that violence, and oftentimes this is really disgusting stuff that nobody on the right stands for and conservatives over and over condemn. Yet they say, oh no, this person is a conservative, is a member of the right. The right needs to own this. Meanwhile, they're constantly saying, oh, the left is let off the hook. And that double standard is part of what's making things worse in this country. We are lying about the real threats here. And thank God we have President Trump in the White House. We have people who are looking at this, trying to correct some of that really horrible bias that we saw from the last administration. But it's an uphill battle.